For the first time in the history of the United States military, an American sea drone has been used to kill in combat. On the night of July 12th, 3 small autonomous boats, 24 feet long, packed with explosives, ran in a straight line toward a raised dock at Iran's Bandar Abbas naval base and detonated against a Ghadir-class midget submarine sitting out of the water on a maintenance gantry. CENTCOM released the overhead footage itself. You can watch the 3 white wakes converge on the dock, watch the first explosion, then the second, then a final blast that sends a column of black smoke and fire into the night sky over Iran's largest naval facility on the Strait of Hormuz. No pilot, no crew, no American life anywhere near the blast radius, just a machine that Washington had been quietly fielding in the region since March, used for the first time to end something instead of watch it. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why this moment matters, you need the full shape of what's been happening in the week leading up to it, and it has been one of the most volatile weeks of this entire war. The ceasefire that had held, more or less, since April, and the 60-day negotiating framework signed in Islamabad on June 17th, started coming apart in the first days of July. Iranian forces fired on a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the strait. CENTCOM responded with strikes. Iran then disabled a second vessel off the coast of Oman. The United States responded again. By the time President Trump left the NATO summit in Ankara on July 8th, he was telling reporters flatly that the ceasefire was over, and Washington revoked the export license that had been allowing Iran to sell oil under the terms of the June agreement. Over the following days, U.S. forces launched wave after wave of strikes, more than 80 targets in one accounting, and by the weekend of July 12th, CENTCOM said the cumulative number of targets struck since the renewed hostilities began had passed 300. Iran hit back hard across the region. Iranian forces struck an airbase in Jordan and fired missiles that triggered air defense responses from the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard issued a statement carried by the Associated Press declaring, in its own words, that the Strait of Hormuz is Iranian territory, and vowing it would not allow what it called a rogue army from the other side of the world to continue what it termed illegal interference. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Joint Military Command went further this week, warning Gulf states directly that any cooperation with American forces, including logistical support, would be treated as an act of war against Iran's sovereignty. That is the fight over a single word, control, that has now completely swallowed the diplomatic process. Here's where it gets significantly worse. The June Memorandum of Understanding was deliberately vague about who actually administers the strait during the 60-day negotiating window, and Iran interpreted that vagueness aggressively. Iranian officials argued the agreement's language committing to use best efforts to ensure safe passage effectively meant ships had to coordinate their routing with Tehran before transiting, functionally a toll booth on one of the most valuable shipping lanes on the planet. When ships didn't comply with Iran's preferred routing, Iranian forces treated that as grounds to strike them, which is exactly what happened to the container ship and the vessel off Oman in the first week of July. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, had reportedly signaled Tehran's agreement to the terms of safe passage, then walked that position back within days, right around the time the attacks on shipping resumed. Washington's answer to that walkback was not subtle. Read that carefully, because it's the sentence that explains everything that happened over the following 72 hours. On July 13th, President Trump told Fox News, quote, "We're going to keep the strait, and we'll probably run it," closing with the phrase that's now defining this entire phase of the war. "We'll become the guardian of the strait." 2 hours later, he posted on Truth Social that the United States would immediately reinstate its naval blockade of Iranian shipping, effective that Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time, and that the U.S. would begin charging a 20% fee on all cargo transiting the strait, a toll he framed as fair reimbursement for what he called 50 years of guarding the waterway for nothing. There's an obvious problem buried in that plan, and even Trump's own administration has pointed it out. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had said publicly weeks earlier that no country is allowed to charge tolls or fees on an international waterway, that it's a violation of existing international law. Trump's proposal would have the United States doing the exact thing Washington has spent months condemning Iran for threatening to do. Whether that toll plan is a real executable policy, or, as some analysts put it, Trump thinking out loud in public, is genuinely unclear as of this writing. What is clear is the message it sends to Tehran. After 10 broken deals, in Trump's own words to reporters that week describing Iran as, quote, "a bad group of people, they've been this way for a long time," Washington has stopped treating the Straits administration as a subject for negotiation at all. Iran is not accepting that framing. Both governments are now publicly, simultaneously, claiming ownership of the same waterway, and the traffic numbers tell you how badly that standoff is functioning in practice. Ship tracking data from K-Peeler, cited by Reuters, showed only 6 vessels transited the strait on Sunday, compared with 138 vessels a day that moved through it before this war began. Brent crude, which had spiked as high as $126 a barrel during the height of the fighting back in April, remains well below that peak, but jumped again this week on exactly the kind of uncertainty a mutual ownership claim over a choke point like this creates. Stocks fell across Europe and Asia at the start of the week, and Wall Street futures dipped on the same news. Now, let's talk about the weapons doing the actual work in this latest wave, because the technical picture here is unusually well documented for a war this chaotic, and it tells its own story about where American strategy is headed. The sea drone that struck Bandar Abbas is called the Corsair, built by a Texas company named Saranac. It's a 24-foot diesel-powered unmanned surface vessel, capable of carrying a 1,000-pound payload over a range of more than 1,000 nautical miles, with a top speed above 35 knots, roughly 40 miles an hour. The Navy signed a $392 million production contract with Saranac back in December 2025, and the company has already built at least 300 of these boats. Task Force 59, the 5th Fleet's dedicated unmanned systems unit, began fielding Corsairs in the region in late March, initially in surveillance and support roles. The same platform made headlines a month earlier, in June, when a Corsair operated by Task Force 59 helped rescue 2 American soldiers whose Army Apache helicopter had gone down near the Strait of Hormuz. What happened at Bandar Abbas on July 12th was the first time this specific tool was turned from a rescue and reconnaissance asset into a strike weapon, and interestingly, U.S. Naval Institute News reported that the Navy did not actually oversee this specific operation. It was run directly by CENTCOM, not through Task Force 59's normal chain, a detail that suggests Washington may be building parallel strike capability outside its existing unmanned systems unit, possibly to keep options open for operations the Navy itself isn't positioned or willing to run. The target CENTCOM chose is not incidental. Bandar Abbas is the headquarters of Iran's regular navy, sitting directly on the Strait of Hormuz, and the specific vessel destroyed was a Ghadir-class midget submarine, a small, difficult-to-detect boat Iran has used for asymmetric operations, including, analysts believe, some of the naval mine-laying that has plagued the strait since the war's early weeks. Iran is estimated to have somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 naval mines, and the majority of the small boats and mine layers needed to deploy them. And by some reporting, Iran itself has lost track of exactly where all of the mines it has already laid actually are. Hitting a submarine maintenance facility in that context isn't just about destroying one vessel. It's about degrading the specific infrastructure Iran needs to keep threatening the strait covertly underneath the surface in ways that are much harder for American forces to see coming than a ballistic missile launch. Alongside the sea drones, CENTCOM's strike package that week also leaned on a second unmanned platform worth understanding, the Lucas drone, built by an Arizona company called SpectreWorks. This is where the story gets almost uncomfortably ironic. Lucas is a reverse-engineered version of Iran's own Shahed 136, the same delta-wing kamikaze drone Iran has supplied to Russia for years to hammer Ukrainian cities, and the same drone family Iran has used repeatedly against American bases and Gulf allies throughout this war. CENTCOM first flew the American version in February and has been explicit about the symbolism. This is, in the command's own framing, low-cost drones modeled after Iran's Shahed platform, delivering American-made retribution back at the source. Combined with Task Force Scorpion Strike operating on land and Task Force 59 operating at sea, defense analysts increasingly describe this as evidence of a coordinated, deliberate American effort to build a full regional drone strike network across this theater, not a series of one-off responses. None of that replaces the traditional force package, still doing most of the work. F-18s off carriers, F-35s, and F-16 Wild Weasels running suppression of enemy air defenses, hunting down the radar signatures of Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries so they can be destroyed before they threaten American aircraft, have all been part of every wave this month. What's changed is the addition of a genuinely new layer underneath and alongside that traditional air campaign, cheap, autonomous, expendable systems that let CENTCOM strike heavily defended coastal and maritime targets without putting a single American life inside the engagement envelope. For a war being fought largely over control of a 110-mile-long stretch of water, that is not a minor technical footnote. It is arguably the single most important operational shift of the entire conflict. It's also worth being honest about what these systems can't do. Air power and sea drones can degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping. They can destroy submarines, radar sites, coastal missile batteries, and fast attack boats faster than Iran can rebuild them. What they cannot do, on their own, is force a change in who governs Iran or resolve the underlying dispute over who administers the strait once the shooting stops. That would require either a negotiated settlement that neither side currently seems willing to accept, or a much larger commitment of forces on the ground that nothing in the current American posture suggests is being planned. In the middle of all of this, the war absorbed a genuinely unrelated shock. The death of Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most prominent voices in the Senate pushing for a hard line against Tehran, and a 5-term senator and Air Force veteran. Graham died on July 12th after a brief, sudden illness following his return from a trip to Ukraine. The D. C. Medical examiner's preliminary finding attributed the cause to an aortic dissection linked to cardiovascular disease, a natural cause. It's worth repeating clearly because claims to the contrary have circulated aggressively this week. There's no verified reporting tying Iran to Graham's death, and Iranian state media running front-page headlines invoking his name alongside the president's does not change the medical facts of how he died. Treating that kind of state propaganda as confirmed fact on either side is exactly the failure mode that makes an already chaotic information war more dangerous. So where does all of this actually leave the strategic picture as of tonight? The April ceasefire and the June memorandum of understanding are not formally torn up, but neither is functioning as either side intended. Washington has reinstated its blockade of Iranian shipping, floated a toll regime its own State Department previously called illegal under international law, and demonstrated, with the Bandar Abbas strike, that it now has an entirely new class of weapon purpose-built for exactly this kind of confined, contested waterway. Iran, for its part, is publicly insisting on control over the strait it does not currently have the military capacity to enforce, striking at Gulf neighbors hosting American forces, and leaning on increasingly aggressive rhetoric from its military command, even as its coastal defenses, radar network, and naval infrastructure are being systematically dismantled night after night. The honest structural risk sitting underneath all of this isn't really about which side wins the next individual strike. It's that both governments are now making simultaneous, incompatible, and very public claims to sovereign control over the same waterway, with active military forces enforcing those claims in the same contested airspace and water at the same time. Add in Iran's own admission, by some reporting, that it has lost track of portions of the minefield it laid earlier in the war. Add in a U.S. strike doctrine that is visibly expanding its toolkit week over week, and add in a diplomatic framework that both sides are simultaneously calling dead and still technically operating under. And you have exactly the kind of layered uncertainty that produces miscalculation rather than resolution. The 3 small boats that ran into Bandar Abbas on July 12th made history, the first American sea drones ever used to kill in combat. But they didn't end anything. They were one entry in a strike list that had already passed 300 targets by the weekend, in a war where the two governments involved can't even agree on who owns the water. The fighting is actually about. Whether the next round of this standoff plays out through more diplomacy, more autonomous weapons doing the fighting instead of people, or something considerably worse, is still, tonight, an open question that nobody, least of all the two governments arguing over a 110-mile strip of ocean, has actually answered.